I find it like a very tinny and unattractive word.
If at first you don't succeed, do it again and better, having learnt from the first time.
I was shaking my head all the way through thinking, there you go, that's how it's done.
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this episode we're going to be talking about success. We'll hear from Man Booker Prize winner Arundhati Roy, Waterstones Book of the Year winner Sarah Perry, and here in the studio we are joined by a woman who knows plenty about success, in no small part due to her fabulous podcast and book, How to Fail. It's Elizabeth Day. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's very, very much my pleasure. I'm of course also here with Holly and Dan. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi. Now, Elizabeth, you may know this already, but at the beginning of each podcast I ask Holly and Dan to bring something to the table, to share something. And I was thinking that for this episode we could all share a failure, but of course I think I should go first and in a moment of great honesty admit to the audience that this is not the first time we've had this conversation, is it?
It isn't, Will. Now why is that? Tell us.
So for me to go first with my failure, we recorded this episode of the podcast and then in a moment of great technical savagery my laptop replaced the audio from the recording with a completely different bit of audio when I was editing the podcast together, therefore deleting what we had recorded. And we have tried everything. If you are in tech and you know how to retrieve a lost file in GarageBand, please tell me, because we could not. It just seems to be impossible. So we are back again to have another go.
And that is absolutely what I'm about. Yeah. If at first you don't succeed, do it again and better, having learnt from the first time.
I think that's the best I can possibly hope for, and I can only apologise once again for being such a complete klutz. But there we go.
Poor you. It's fine. The room is so much cooler this time. The first time we recorded it was incredibly stuffy. Yeah. It's because you've done David Nichols in the morning, and he's a very sweaty man. No, I'm joking. That's only a joke. That's a joke. He's lovely. He's not actually.
This is going to be a great headline. Elizabeth Day says David Nichols is sweaty or talks a lot of hot air.
That would have been better.
Yeah. It's much cooler today, so I'm hoping we can all be a little bit more relaxed. Me having fronted up first with my failure, who would like to now take the mantle and explain how they have failed?
I'm happy to. I've always got so many failures. So I've got two failures, one big and one small. The big one is that because, ironically, How to Fail, the book and the podcast have been quite successful, I've been doing an enormous amount of promo and work over the last few months, which has been great, but it means that I've been less good at getting back to emails and arranging to see friends. And actually my friends are the most important thing in my life. So that really bothers me that I haven't had time to properly see the people that I most love. So I'm hoping now it's calmed down a bit, I can be better as a friend. And the second mini failure I have is that the weather has been so humid lately and my hair is a massive frizzball. And I have lived a long time on this planet and I still have no cure for it. It just literally, as soon as it reaches the atmosphere, my hair turns into just like a crinkle crisp. So that's my second failure.
For anybody listening, if you've seen that episode of Friends where Monica goes to the Caribbean, it's basically that.
It's literally that, except I put it up because that's it. I literally got on the tube this morning and started sweating terribly. And I just haven't recovered since, so I've just had to put my hair up and claim defeat.
I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. Your hair looks lovely though.
Well, thanks. That's because I have now learned after the last week to tie it up before I leave the house.
Because
otherwise I kind of get into work really hot and then I tie it up and it's at that point it's gone. It's happened.
We're doing beauty tips on the podcast. Yeah. Tie your hair up before you leave the house.
In fact, look at Dan's fringe.
I mean,
the volume on that.
My hair just has a lot of volume anyway.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I used to want to kind of like having like long hair was a thing amongst my friendship circle.
When were you young? Like the 1970s.
Well, no, it's like when like Kings of Leon were like a thing and they had their long hair in the 70s. But I like wanted to grow it, and instead of I was growing it for ages and my parents were like, oh yeah, just keep going, it will drop eventually, and it just kind of got bigger and bigger. Ended up with like this kind of like big ginger afro, which wasn't the look I was going for. That wasn't my failure. I'm going to go with a string of 3 swimming failures today. My ability to have common sense, or I don't have any common sense essentially, is what these 3 reveal. So I've had in a quick fire succession, I went swimming on holiday. Every time I go on holiday, something happens in a pool. One year I went... cut that. Every year when I go on holiday, I have a mishap in a pool. That's not going to work either.
Shut yourself in the pool. That's what you're going for.
I have not gone that far. One time I was in the pool and I had my phone in my pocket of my swimming shorts, was stood with the waterline below my swimming shorts and below my phone for like 10 minutes, and then decided to dive in, and then obviously my phone was ruined, which was quite humorously followed by me emerging from the water just shouting rice at a waiter and then kind of looking at me blankly. I've had another occasion on which I've like dived in.
Either, I think, is fine.
Yeah.
Belly flopped into the shallow end of a swimming pool, and like the first day of my holiday, and just kind of like smacked my nose on the bottom. And then a while ago, I grew up in Norfolk, as I've probably mentioned on this. We took a trip to Wells, which has like a huge, like when the tide goes out, it really goes out. Mm-hmm. Like it's kind of goes out for, I'm going to say half a mile. That's probably wrong. It's massive, but it also has this massive rip tide as a result. And I decided to dive into that with my glasses on and emerged in the middle of the ocean without my glasses, or just seeing them like being swept away out to sea. And then I'd driven to the beach, and I had to therefore like work out how to get home without being able to see.
Oh, damn.
So a whole host of swimming failures.
You
for
need
you
to
there.
stay away from the water.
Stay away from water.
It's never going to be safe for you to go back in the water.
Nice. That's an our generation joke.
Yeah, exactly. For those of you who were young in the 70s, you're going to love that reference. Holly, what have you got for us?
So I am going to talk about a very embarrassing failure that I had recently when I was closing an event that we had hosted for Julian Barnes for about 400 people, and I got up and decided to go with some fancy wording. Normally I would say thanks everyone for coming, go and grab some wine, but instead I wanted to go for please everyone join me in thanking Julian, but instead of that I said please everyone thank me.
I love that.
Oh my God.
I was so mortified, so embarrassed. Everyone in the audience found it hilarious, apart from Julian, who actually hadn't been listening. So he didn't understand why everyone was laughing. I had to stand there quaking, like, oh gosh, I can't believe this has happened, before then having to re-say, please join me in thanking, and it was just so embarrassing.
Had to wait for the laughter to die down.
Yeah,
That's
it was awful.
Not a sound you want to hear at the end of a book event, just sort of uproarious laugh. Also,
there we go.
I really hope that, I mean, I love this idea that you'd said that and they'd all sort of gone, thank you, but that didn't happen.
No, absolutely not.
Oh, it's a shame.
And Dan, like, laughing in the sidelines, obviously found it hilarious.
Yeah, it was just myself and a colleague stood in the wings kind of going, did she do that? She did that.
She definitely did that. We've all fronted up there. We've shared some failures, Elizabeth, and obviously with your book and podcast, you ask your guests to do the same. But we're, of course, doing this podcast which is about success. But, of course, why are failure and success inextricably linked, do you think?
Well, for me, they are two sides of the same coin. So you can't fully appreciate success without also having experienced the sort of seamy underbelly of failure. But I think also that in learning how to cope with failure, because failure is something that happens to us all, it's a very democratizing thing, it just is, it's a fact of life. But in choosing to build on failure and learn from it, you build up your emotional resilience, and that makes you not only more prepared for success when it comes, but makes success more likely to happen. And I start my book with a quote from Truman Capote, which says that failure is the condiment that gives success its flavour. And I think that that's absolutely it, that you can't taste the fullness of success or happiness unless you've also experienced failure and to some extent sadness.
In light of your failure for the week, I can't help but just hear all of this as like a coaching or therapy session for Will, with the podcast being called Success, and you saying your failure and then success, it will be worth it.
I mean, I really hope it is, obviously, but I tell you, it was one of those moments, like when I realised what had happened, it was the closest I've ever come to spontaneously bursting into tears at work.
Wow.
Because it was just, there's just a lot going on, you know, to getting it all together. And I just thought, this is not what I need. And it wasn't because I hadn't actually deleted it. To technology had stepped in and ruined my life, and it's just so frustrating that you can't do anything about it.
It's one of my worst fears, I have to say. Whenever I do interviews as a journalist, I go along with a tape recorder. Well, actually now I use an app on my phone because I'm no longer living in the 70s.
With Dan's hair.
Yeah, so I record the interview, but I'm always paranoid that the recording isn't going to work, and so I take notes as well. But I'm talking to someone as I'm taking notes, so it looks like I'm sort of doing automatic writing and communing with ghosts. And it really puts some people off. So many people comment on it. They're like, oh my God, I can't believe you're taking notes. Yeah, I was like, well... Anyway, and so I completely appreciate how horrible it is when it happens.
Well, we're here now. We've got through that stage.
We have.
When you were putting together your podcast series, obviously you started off with some very well-known faces and names, and then as it's developed, you've incorporated people from all walks of life, which I find really interesting. And I wondered, for you, listening to these failures, were there any great differences in the experience, or are the lessons basically the same for people, whoever they are?
I think generally speaking, the lessons are actually gratifyingly the same. And when I say gratifying, I mean because I am a firm believer in the notion that what connects us is greater than what sets us apart. So many people, whether it be Phoebe Waller-Bridge or Alistair Campbell or Otega Uwagba or Dame Kelly Holmes, have had similar struggles with either mental health or feeling lost in their 20s or having massive career pivots. But the one thing that I do think is interesting is that when I interview someone who is bona fide famous and a celebrity, like Phoebe, for instance, it's very interesting how they cope with that fame and that level of recognition, because so often they are recognised in public, and members of the public will have certain preconceptions about this person and who they are and how they've got it nailed. And actually there's a lot of other stuff going on underneath that is a lot more vulnerable. And the beauty of my podcast is that I think it offers a safe space for those people to open up about those vulnerabilities. And Phoebe actually came back on in season 5 and talked about her last year. So she was my first ever guest on How to Fail. And she came back on and she talked about those 12 months where to many of us she became the epitome of success because of Fleabag 2 and Killing Eve. And actually she chose her 3 failures from those 12 months. And it was really interesting to learn from her that there had been so much going on under the surface as well. So I think that's the main difference.
When you sort of did your first season, eventually you did do an episode where you spoke about your own failures because you thought it was only fair with everybody sharing theirs. But obviously with the book, there's very much more of you in that book and you sort of talking about your own failures. Were you more capable, I suppose, of sharing those things because of what had come before with the podcast, or do you think you'd have been happy to kind of go there straight away?
That's such a good question. I definitely think I was more comfortable. I think I would have been able to do it anyway, but I would have felt much more vulnerable doing it. I am something of a natural sharer, and because I do believe that connection is really the reason for us to be alive as humans. So I'm very, as Will knows, because we met at a dinner a few years ago and basically shared our life stories within about 10 minutes, and you missed your last train and I told you everything about my divorce and my failure to have children and stuff. So I do have that natural inclination. But what the podcast taught me was that the things that I thought were most personal to me, and to some degree the things that I was most ashamed of, wrongfully so, I think, in my own life, actually turned out to have the most universal resonance. So I realised that in being my most authentic self and being vulnerable in a public sphere, actually the response I got was so incredible. And there were so many other people who felt able to share their stories. Even friends of mine who had never spoken to me about their own struggles with infertility were able to open up to me. So that was a really supported frame of mind to go into writing the book in. And therefore I think it made me feel more confident that what I had to say was worthwhile.
We're going to move very much onto success now, because we're going to hear from one of our recorded authors. And I find it really interesting that when talking about failure, we end up talking about success. And in talking to her about success, we will end up hearing about how difficult it was for her to deal with her success. Of course, Arundhati Roy is the author I'm talking about, and it was over 20 years ago I realised that her debut novel, The God of Small Things, won the Man Booker Prize. She was catapulted to fame all over the globe, and it made a huge difference to her life. But as we'll hear from this interview, it wasn't just her that was affected, it was her friends and family too.
I find it like a very tinny and unattractive word because, to be considered successful in a world that one is so at odds with is funny, So I wouldn't use that word to describe anything about myself, but there is something called what would I say? It's a kind of relief, when the blood in your veins begins to flow more easily. And that always happens to me when I know that I have managed to write what I really think, or what I really want to, when I have closed the gap between language and thought. It doesn't have anything to do with how it's received by other people or what prizes it wins necessarily. Winning the Booker Prize was a great thing. I mean, obviously it's not something I'm going to carp about, of course not. But it isn't as simple as what people think. It wasn't just like, oh, isn't this wonderful? Because it became my middle name, Arundhati, Booker Prize winner, Roy. And when I decided, I just knew that, I wasn't the person who's going to now move away from my old life to be where others, quote unquote, successful people live and mill around. So that kind of spotlight, that kind of fame, and continuing to live in your old life with your friends and the people that you love, meant that they all had to deal with it. It wasn't just me. And that was really difficult, because from being a group of very egalitarian people, suddenly one person is just pulled out and doesn't want to be pulled out, and wants to be in solidarity with so much. And so how do you do that with grace? And it involves grace on everyone's part, not just mine. It was really traumatic and difficult. Also because it also happened at a time when suddenly India started moving sharply to the right, and nationalism, majoritarianism, nuclear tests, this huge move towards what they call development, but what was ending in tragedy for people, was happening. And it was really complicated, because on the one hand it gave me the space and the ability to write, to be heard, to speak about it. And on the other hand, even there, even amongst your own comrades, why is the camera only pointing at you? That's just the opposite of what it's meant to be. And yet it's important that that voice is being heard, And there was the question of money, which was a very difficult thing to deal with, because I had never had money, and it was never something that I had, I'd never done anything. I'd done things in order to survive, but I had never done anything in order to make a lot of money. But suddenly I did, And how do you share that? How do you deploy it in solidarity rather than otherwise? There was a point at which I felt as though every feeling in the God of Small Things had been traded in for a silver coin,
right.
And I could just become this little silver figurine, and I had to break that and find a way of, giving money away also has its own conflicts and creates real problems. And but now it's all fine, because I found a way of doing it, and I found a way of handling it. But so it was not simple. It was wonderful, but it's not simple.
Absolutely not. So as you're saying there, that one way of dealing with it is to sort of spread out the success and share it with people, but also being aware that what you're also sharing are the negative aspects that come with notoriety or success, or having that sort of spotlight on
everything. When I was saying things about Kashmir, or when there have been occasions when kind of mobs have turned up at my house, sometimes at the wrong house, you know, and you're like, oh God, you know, I don't expect other people to take the consequences of what I'm doing, and they have to sometimes, and they've had to. So, you know, there's nothing to complain about, but I'm just saying it's not as simple as it seems, you know. It's because the beautiful thing about it all is that eventually today I'm the kind of writer in India who's not who doesn't have to be interpreted through prizes and reviews and some kind of establishment that's presenting me. It's like a direct shot into the bloodstream, you know. So there's protest, there's love, there's my own book being sold, pirated, Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Would you like to buy it for half price, you know, at the traffic lights? And it's great, you know. It's not somehow that kind of separation between literature and society has been broken. So I don't have to be presented through anyone now, you know.
When you talk about the way that you write, the relationships that you have with your characters, you sound to me as though you're an artist who gets the greatest pleasure from creating the art, and you don't think about the sort of any remuneration that might come after it. You know, that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you have these characters that you want to share with the world. Is that right?
You can't. I mean, you know, I don't think that either the God. I mean, obviously, when I wrote The God of Small Things, I didn't even know that kind of success is possible in literature. You know, I used to work in cinema, and when I wrote The God of Small Things, I thought I was downshifting. You know, like, you know, 300 people perhaps maybe would read it. But once that happened, I had a choice between, you know, trying to duplicate that success and write The God of Small Things in different ways, you know, the son of the God of Small Things type of thing. Or I had the choice of rolling the dice, which is what I did in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. You know, yesterday I was doing the Sebald lecture on literary translation, and I was saying how when you write and work in a country where 780 languages are spoken and there are 22 official languages, and, you know, I myself am such a hybrid of all kinds of places and people and languages. So each book, especially each novel, you have to make the language for it. And, you know, to take the lyrical voice, let's say, of the God of Small Things and use it for the Ministry of Utmost Happiness isn't possible. Of course, there will be echoes of it, but to me, in the Ministry, the risk of form and of voice was literally like taking the voice of the God of the language of the God of Small Things, up a very tall building and throwing it down and watching it break, and then going down and picking up the pieces, the shards, and doing something which was very, very risky. And I could take that risk because, you know, I was not, you know, I had already written that, whatever, 8 million copies seller, so why not take the risk, you know?
How do you follow that, quite frankly? Like, what an incredible clip. And how incredibly she thinks. I love that thing that she was saying about when writing is going well and feeling your blood sitting better in the veins. This is why I'm not Arundhati born, because I can't even remember how she puts it. But I think that that's really interesting because that massively ties in with what I think of as success, which is knowing yourself, like the truest, most authentic, most honest version of yourself, where you have to come face to face with all the things that you don't like and all your weaknesses and your frailties. It's knowing yourself, and it's taking joy in the task that you're doing, rather than, as she was saying, projecting and imagining what the audience will think of it once you release it.
And also, having achieved success, she was so conscientious and kind of, yes, I have the success. Yes, I'm being heralded as this kind of literary figure, but also what is heralding me hiding what is going on in India, what's going on in various places in the world that you trumpeting me is blocking. And just to kind of think like that, it's such a, I mean, it's just humbling listening to it. I don't know how else to describe
she was
it.
constantly thinking about how her success was going to affect the people around her, her friends and her family. And she clearly has this group of friends who are sort of almost more than friends. They've got like a community, you know. And so that was clearly the thing that was very upsetting for her, to see them being scrutinised or followed or harassed or whatever it might be. And there aren't many people who think that widely, are they, about their success.
I think the thing that came to me throughout that whole clip was just her self-awareness of everything that she has done through the writing process, and as you say, that kind of understanding and empathy towards people who have been directly affected by it.
Well, so I think that there was a sense too that she knows that success is transient. And success is seen in such a two-dimensional way by our society now, I think, because success is viewed as the ultimate goal. Like, when I get there and when I am successful, everything will be wonderful and I can eat candy floss and balloons will fall from the sky. And I feel that it's equivalent to happiness. There is a lot talked about in our current society about how happiness is the ultimate goal. And actually, I believe that both happiness and success are great when you have them, but they are transient, and that's what they should be. And actually, the deeper, more profound stability comes from something like contentment, or, as she was saying, getting joy from doing the task itself.
Or like equilibrium or something like that, kind of being able to balance that, and also recognizing what success means to you. This is something you touched on right at the beginning, between the personal and professional, and also Arundhati Roy touched on then, is kind of, what does success look like? Is success monetary? Is success prizes? Is success getting, marrying word and thought or whatever?
Closing the gap between word and thought, which is an incredible phrase. But I think for any artistic endeavour, so whether it's word or thought, or whether it's, I mean, for me, I suppose as an actor, completely transient experience on stage every night. You do the show and it disappears, but you know when you've hit it right, because you have that moment of connection between you and the audience, and that, you know when that's right and you know when it's wrong, because it's completely clear.
But also, I imagine, and you'll probably be able to attest to this better than me as someone who doesn't write, but also that moment that Arundhati Roy spoke about, of kind of feeling like you've managed to marry those two ideas together and you've got it successfully down on the page. I imagine that's quite fleeting as well, and that when you've written something, you might go, yeah, that's perfect, I loved it, and then reread it at another moment and go, oh, actually,
there's an awful lot of that. And when you're writing novels, when I've written 4, there's that constant push and pull between, this is absolute rubbish, and then it's like, no, remember what happened last time, maybe it's not that rubbish, and maybe you have to but I just like Arundhati Roy, I've often described it as like, when writing is going well, I feel untangled. It feels, and I compare it a bit to like hitting a perfect flow in yoga. There's just like a sense that you're just doing what you should be doing, and moving how you should be moving, and thinking how you should be thinking. And those moments are worth everything. And I have to say that obviously when I'm writing a book, I want it to be successful. So I'm not just doing it for the good of my soul. I'm doing it because, as Will was getting at there, I want to connect with the most amount of people I can connect with, because for me that's the meaning of life. It's like, ultimately it's like connection. And so therefore I want it to be a success, because I want there to be a conduit to get it to more people. So I'm not entirely, unself-interested in that respect. I do want it to do well. And I do want it to be in the Waterstones Piccadilly window display, which I couldn't help but notice that How to Fail wasn't today.
Subtle hint.
No, but I love the Waterstones Piccadilly window display is always just a phenomenal work of art. I love it.
And hotly contested. I don't know what's in there at the moment, but I mean, you're more than welcome on your way out to just do a bit of
Love one
rearranging.
in.
I mean, that's not How to Fail, that's How to Win at Waterstones Piccadilly. We're going to hear from another author now, and what's really interesting is that when talking to authors about the same topic, they can sometimes say almost diametrically opposed things without it actually being the opposite. There's also this thing about not deserving success, which I find really interesting with writers, even though they sit there and they work and they craft and they craft and they craft, and then when one of their books is a success, they often are a bit like, why that one? What's happened there? We're going to hear from Sarah Perry, and I spoke to her. It was on the publication of her most recent novel, Melmoth, but her previous book, The Essex Serpent, was Waterstones Book of the Year back in 2016, and it was one of those years where it seemed to me that everybody had a copy of that book in their hands. It was absolutely everywhere. So what was that like for her, I wondered?
Very complicated, I think. I think a lot of it has to do with a feeling that nobody really deserves that level of success, and the knowledge that there are so many arbitrary factors that come into play. I don't just mean my having encountered the legend in the first place. I mean things like something in the book, unintentionally on my part, capturing something that was in the water, so to speak, at the time, and the cover being so extraordinary, and perhaps doing something with historical fiction that people were looking for but perhaps hadn't encountered in a while, booksellers happening to fall in love with it, social media being so important. So it's like this perfect storm that is completely, you cannot reproduce it. The factors are, I wrote the book, granted, but all of the other factors are out of my hands. So my reaction to it has been complete joy, because I'm not one of those writers who writes for my own sake. I write for my readers, and I would no more write a book and not want lots of people to read it than I would cook a meal and not want lots of people to eat it. Like, I very much see it as being a transaction with readers. So I'm completely delighted. But then also there's this sort of Puritan feeling of a sinner such as myself does not deserve such blessings, and consequently I'm going to take a public beating in punishment for it. So what I've had to do is reorient my idea of success. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for me because I do want to please people. So for a long time my idea of success was on how many people were pleased with me and how many people said, good girl, well done. And I've realised that actually from now on, I hope my idea of success will be, have I got better? I want to never write another book as bad as The Essex Serpent again, if you see what I mean. I want every book to be better, and then the next book to be better than that. And if I can focus on that as my kind of matrix of success, then I won't go mad.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
What does it do? I mean, for you as a creative person, how far were you into the next book when the success of The Essex Serpent happened?
Deeply into it. I have a very particular way of writing, which is that I have an idea for a book and don't write it for about 4 years until it feels like a book that I've read several times and I must now write in order for it to be passed on to other people. So by the time The Essex Serpent was out, Melmoth was following me everywhere, and I already knew the book that I was going to write after that as well. So I always have like a cab rank of books. And I think that's really important actually for all writers, to not fixate on the thing that's immediately happened to them. Already The Essex Serpent feels very distant to me because I've written Melmoth and I'm writing my next one and I'm looking to the one after that. So, yeah.
So having had, I suppose, an external measure of success, you now have a sort of internal one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember having lunch with my wonderful agent Jenny shortly after the Essex Serpent sort of exploded in the way that it did. And I had become obsessed with how to get better. And I sat with her in a restaurant in Norwich where I live and said, Jenny, how do I get better? I have to get better. This is not good enough. None of this is good enough. I'm not sharp enough. I'm not disciplined enough. I'm not rich enough. I have to get better. What shall I do? What shall I do? So it's not like playing the piano where you can progress from Chopin to Liszt to Rachmaninoff. The measures for how good your books are not that fixed. And she very wisely just said, read up. Read upward. And that's really important, I think. I have to keep reading books so good that they make me quail at how poor my work is, so that you're driven upwards. So that's been very important for me.
Do you think that's a common thing for all creatives, no matter what your field is? I'm thinking partly because I used to be an actor, and I knew that the thing that gave me a kick up the arse is if I watched a performance and went, whoa, I need to really up my game. Do you think that would apply to visual artists, singers?
It must do. It must do. There's this amazing quote from someone. It said, "Talent recognises genius, but mediocrity only knows itself." And I think talented people will always know genius when they see it. And if you don't, then you'll just become mediocre because you're not driving forward. And I suspect it's shared by all of us who make stuff, the ability to look at something extraordinary and think, my God. The book that did that for me most recently was Amy Sackville, Painter to the King. I got halfway through it and thought, yeah, you're not good enough, Perry. But it wasn't depressing, it was thrilling because she'd shown me quite what you can do with prose. And that is the great thing, is to be thrilled by it. And Graham Swift's latest book, Mothering Sunday, that did that to me as well. I was shaking my head all the way through thinking, there you go, that's how it's done.
But that's good, as you say, that's good in a way. It's not a scary thing that stops you from writing. No. It's a thing that actually enthuses
it's utterly
you.
Thrilling. Yeah, really thrilling.
How about the idea that somebody might read your books and have that same experience? Is that too weird to contemplate?
It's strange, yeah. What I would hope for is not a qualitative assessment of my work, but of someone being pleased at how I did what I did, rather than thinking, I wish I could do that, thinking, oh, okay, she did that, that's cool.
I like how she deferred from her own success by saying, I didn't do something, I just picked out something that was already happening. And it kind of raises quite an interesting question about kind of success against things that are topical. Something that comes to mind at the moment is Greta Thunberg and the climate crisis and kind of like campaigning against that. How vocal that movement is a result directly of Greta Thunberg, or is Greta Thunberg a symbol for something that's much wider? Where does the individual sit in relation to something kind of wider going on? Which struck me as really interesting. But it's also kind of a deferring. It's saying, I didn't do this, I'm just capturing something else.
I think it's super interesting, that idea of tapping into something that already exists. But I wonder also, I loved that clip so much and was nodding my head so vociferously at various points, including where she talked about Mothering Sunday by Graham Swift, which is one of the most underrated and brilliant novels of the last decade. I think it's incredible. But I wonder how much of it is a gendered thing as well, because I know that speaking to a lot of, but by no means all, women who have experienced success, there's a sense that they don't feel they deserve it. And they feel a misplaced degree of shame almost at having raised their voice, particularly when they're telling their own stories or writing memoir. And I'm not sure, from my generalised and anecdotal experience of doing the podcast, whether men, with apologies for the two setting here, but whether men have quite the same feelings. Maybe you do, maybe you can enlighten me.
I think it's something to do with awareness, and I think that the patriarchy, if a man is praised, they just seem to they have no qualms in saying, yeah, I did it.
It's like exactly how the world should be if a man. Yes.
Whereas quite often with women or minorities, if someone's kind of praised as success, they'll quite often be aware and say, yes, but, and you kind of saw that with Arundhati Roy. I think that was kind of a prime example of, yes, I've done X, Y, or Z, but this isn't the only story. Is that fair?
Yes, totally.
I think so. I think there's not a mistake that there is a phrase, God give me the confidence of a mediocre white man, because it's sort of this thing of being able to stomp around like it's just the status quo, right? It's just how things are, and there are no qualms about totally deserving any success that you have, and that is, it feels like it's shifting slightly.
Yes.
There's certainly more awareness, as you said, particularly at the moment with female writers of incredibly honest memoirs and essays at the moment, absolutely just bearing their souls to kind of go, this is what it feels like, this is what you go through in these various stages of life. I think are opening a lot of readers' eyes to what life is really like for other people. Arundhati Roy had said that she was writing very much for herself, and it's about getting the words right, and then of course the readers come second. And Sarah Perry had said that she was very much writing for her readers, and yet they both seem to be driven by this need to get it right, to get better at the actual craft of writing, so that whilst their sort of audience dependence is different, the actual craft seems to be the same, coming from the same place. And you've written fiction yourself, Elizabeth, so do you have the same thing when you're sitting there writing fiction? Is it about staying there at the page until it's right.
Yes, but it never is right. So that's the thing. It's Sadie Jones, who is another fantastic author, always said to me, you start out writing a book and you have a vision of a beautiful cathedral. And by the end of the book that you've written, you realise you've got a perfectly serviceable garden shed. Now, and garden sheds are great. It's just not what you imagined at the outset. But I think that is creative drive. That's what gives you the stimulus to keep going. As Sarah Perry was saying, to keep trying to get better, to aim for that cathedral. But the interesting thing for me is that I had to come to terms with the fact that I was never going to write like the writers I most admired. At the time that I started my first novel, I was going through a massive Tom Wolfe phase. I loved The Bonfire of the Vanities. And because I thought he was a brilliant writer, I sort of wanted to write like him. But it didn't come naturally, and it sounded like a terrible pastiche of Tom Wolfe by someone with a received pronunciation English accent. And the revelation for me was when someone read my work and felt that it was valid just as my work, as my voice. And I realised that actually we all have our unique set of experiences, so no one else can ever write entirely like us or create anything entirely like us. And that's good. And that actually my trying to be like someone else diminished my chances of success. I needed to be the most myself I could on the page. But what that means is that I'm never fully satisfied when I finish a book, because I always see the imperfections and how it could be improved. But I think that that's a good thing, because as Sarah Perry so brilliantly said, you need to keep getting better. And I love that idea that she had about reading up.
Yeah.
Such a good one. I mean, I'm a big one for just like reading everything, like imbibing everything and reading around, and like I watch The Real Housewives at the same time as I might be reading Anna Karenina. I'm a big believer in that kind of stuff.
I love this idea of reading up as well, and it kind of reminds me of a notion of utopia that's quite prominent on like the left with a capital L, the political left.
Not just your actual left, because I'm sitting on your left.
Elizabeth's idea of utopia, which is rather than something you're aiming towards and as a fixed end goal, it's something that lies at the centre and that you orbit around and can never really attain, but you kind of catch glimpses of it or kind of see it, but you can never quite get there. And it strikes me as pertinent to success as well, is this idea of something that you can kind of, you're constantly skirting or aiming for or kind of dwelling on, but never really attaining, or if you do, it's only fleetingly.
I think that's why people don't shout about their success enough, because in your mind it might not be the end result that you are aiming for, and therefore you don't feel like you can share that and celebrate what you have done. But to other people, it is a fantastic end goal and result.
Also, we've got a very English thing, haven't we? Just about being embarrassed about success, or when people compliment you on something that you've done, it's like, oh, no, it's nothing.
Oh, this old thing. Yeah. I like that thing. Yeah.
You just never ever see Americans doing that, for example. They're just like, hell yeah, I did that, and yeah, I deserve a high five and a pat on the back. You know, it's just sort of completely different attitude. You were mentioning there as well about through the writing of taking time to actually find your own voice. We have a bit of an obsession in this country about debuts, you know, always trying to find new voices, but there isn't that sort of culture of allowing writers to develop their craft, to find their voice. It used to be sort of, 30, 40 years ago that authors would be terribly embarrassed by their first or maybe their second novel. It was considered juvenilia, and it would be sort of, I mean, some authors even had theirs recalled, like pulped and never read again, but that really seems to have changed. Is that partly to do with the pressure to break through and to kind of immediately make your mark, or should we be giving authors a bit more time to actually sort of develop?
Oh, I'd love there to be more time for authors to develop. I think it's because we live in an age where we fetishise youth. And again, I think that's changing slowly, but it is starting to change. But that combined with the need to make a splash on social media as part of the marketing of anything now, whatever you're selling, from tights to books, those two things mean that it feels as if an author always needs to have a personal story or like a point that is going to be talked about and a reason for being examined and interviewed and reviewed, because there's only so much limited space to do that. And it's easier to do if it's a first-time author from the point of view of a publisher, because they don't have a disappointing track record yet. So you're like, this is going to be the next big thing. If you don't interview this person, then you're going to look like the loser type thing. So all of those things, and I think it's an enormously pressurised environment. And I actually now, with the benefit of hindsight, I really feel for people who get massive advances for their first book. I can say that because I in no way did. And I really feel for them because actually if your book doesn't recoup that massive advance by selling an enormous amount of copies, you're seen as a disappointment, but you're not. You probably sold loads of copies, it's just that you haven't been able to recoup that. So I actually think that that's a very debilitating thing for authors.
Yeah.
There needs to be less money in publishing, said no one ever. I'm totally fine with getting massive advances now, by the way.
Absolutely, yeah. Please provide your address for that advance to be sent to. We've actually, through the conversation, we've actually mentioned a few books which we think are huge successes. But what we do at the end of each podcast is to hear from booksellers around the country who will provide recommendations based on whichever theme we've been talking about. So let's hear from them now with their recommendations based on success.
Hi, I'm Georgina from Leeds, and the book I'd like to recommend for success is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. Our Waterstones Children's Book Prize winner's second book is equally unmissable. It's a fierce story of ambition, inequality and fighting to be heard.
Hi, I'm Katrina from Glasgow, and my recommendation on the topic of success is Range by David Epstein. In Range, Epstein argues that specialising from a really early point in your career isn't necessarily advantageous, and that actually in a modern complex world, having a range of analogies and experiences to draw from can actually make you much better at what you do than having to specialise far too early on. It's really, really fascinating.
Hi, I'm Emma from Carmarthen, and a great book to read about success would be Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, simply because the plot twist at the end is nothing short of mind-blowing.
So there we go. We've learned that failure and success are two sides of the same coin. I think you sort of said earlier on, Elizabeth. I think that's very wise. And that we have this curious thing that we often bemoan the unfairness of the failures that visit us, but then don't tend to give ourselves a break and champion our own successes. So maybe we could just be a little bit kinder to ourselves and just say yay for us when we have a little moment of joy. Elizabeth, thank you as ever for your honesty and your brilliance. Holly and Dan, thank you again for sharing. We're going to be back in 2 weeks with the last episode of this first season, in which we're going to tackle the thing that it's all about in Albert Square: family. They're always saying that, aren't they? It's all about family. So we're going to be hearing from Jeanette Winterson, A.M. Holmes and Emily Pine, and we very much hope that you will join us. Until then, please feel free to contact us with feedback on social@waterstones.com. Do leave reviews or ratings on your podcast platform of choice. And until we see you again, take care and bye from us all here.
Bye.
So long.
Thank me.